This paper examines the less-known role of John Florio as active collaborator in theatre, from the first period of his career as author of language lessons manuals until his association with important literary patrons like the third Earl of Southampton and Queen Anne of Denmark. I clarify how Florio's hybrid identity as a translator and go-between gave him both the power to readapt Italian works, but it also exposed him to several dangers and criticism, leading him to work mainly as ghostwriter. By examining different far-fetched interpretations concerning his presence in Shakespeare's plays, this paper aims to demonstrate that involvement of the Anglo-Italian is much more important than has hitherto been guessed. The method used is a stylistic-linguistic analysis of Laus Labus Lost, and the sources used in the play, which corroborates the hypothesis that Florio's involvement in this work is the result of a collaboration between the two writers. This dissertation challenged both the role of Shakespeare as the icon of the solo creator and that of John Florio as mere supplier of basic information about Italian folklore, presenting a new, much more interesting and intriguing picture of Shakespeare's writing practice, which involved both translation and readaptation. The connection between John Florio and William Shakespeare has been the object of several studies. From an early speculation that some characters in Shakespeare's plays are parodic portraits of the Anglo-Italian, to claim that Florio is an intermediary from many Italian sources using the plays. Florio defines this word as intermediate, and intermediate, also to interlace or work between, which suggests that his role in Shakespeare's oeuvre is between the playwright and his sources, the primal draft and the final work. This connection has been generally grounded by evidence that they both joined the patronage of Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. The greatest indisputable relation is, however, textual. Florio's first and second fruits contain dialogues and proverbs later used by Shakespeare. Florio's two Italian-English dictionaries, A Word of Words and Queen Anne's New Word of Words, in which he contributed to the English language with more than 1,000 words, represent another important source for Shakespeare's use of language. Ultimately, Florio translated Montaigne's essays. Scholars have identified in Shakespeare's works about 100 passages showing some similarities with Florio's work. Though the identification of Holofernes and other characters as caricatural portraits of Florio, made by an early generation of scholars, has been today generally disregarded due to an oversimplification of his works and personality, there is no doubt that some plays are influenced by his writing style. However, Florio's connection with theatre has been rarely addressed, and it could lead to a different and more exhaustive explanation upon the vexed question of his relations with Shakespeare. Florio's acquaintance with theatre can be traced as early as 1578, with the publication of his first work, First Fruits, which contains dedicatory poems written by the lay men. Richard Tarton, John Bentley, Robert Wilson, and Thomas Clark brought praising poems to Florio, thanking him for having contributed to bring pleasant fruits that would flourish in our English fields. These dedications have brought Florio scholars Arundel del Re to suggest the importance of further investigation into his connection with the London stage, that, however, has not been explored yet. The sources of the language lessons manuals include theatrical works of commedia dell'arte. This is confirmed by the lazzi of the masters and servants in the dialogues, which have names inspired by Italian authors and plots borrowed from 16th century Italian theatre. The translation of Montaigne's essays, as Mathienza persistently shows, is permeated by theatrical sense. which confirms Florio's great confidence with dramatic style. Moreover, Florio owned a library of 400 books, with many comedies, tragedies, commedia dell'arte, and pastoral comedies. Florio was also an important peer of Ben Jonson. A quarto copy of Volpone is extant with a dedication from the playwright, who defines Florio his loving father and worthy friend, and the aid of his muses. From this description it has been assumed that Florio may have collaborated with Jonson on Volpone and other plays. Florio also worked as ghostwriter and editor. In 1585 he published the pamphlet A Letter, latterly written from Rome, beginning a pioneering job in translating Muse from Italy as novels with dramatic dialogues. Later followed perpetual and natural prognostications of the change of weather, a manual of witty sayings and metaphors translated from ancient writers. He worked as anonymous editor for Philip's City in Arcadia in collaboration with Fulk Greville and Matthew Gwynne, and with Italian fencing master Vincenzo Saviolo for his manual Vincenzo Saviolo His Practice. He also translated anonymously Boccalini's Ragguagli di Parnaso in collaboration with William Vaughan and Boccaccio's Decameron. This collaborative activity is confirmed by Florio himself in A Word of Words, in which he underlines to have a great faction of good writers to band with me, which suggests a thick web of challenging relationships between playwrights, editors, and translators enthusiastically collaborating with each other. A play taken into consideration to analyze this possible collaborative role of John Florio in Shakespeare's plays is Law's Labus Lost. Written in the years both authors were under the patronage of the Earl of Southampton. The play does not have a definite source and has been defined one of the happiest for its use and abuse of words. The title comes from a dialogue that Florio wrote in First Fruits. We need not speak so much of love. All books are full of love. With so many authors, they will labus lost to speak of love. The presentation of the patriarchal and anti-patriarchal argument in the play is partially derived from the last dialogue of Second Fruits. Florio's character Silvestro collects and presents as raw material the stock allusion which Birod transmutes, or more properly translates, into poetry. Birod, in his proverbial remark that a woman is like a German clock, is just the kind of remarks that Florio puts in the mouth of his anti-patriarchist character Pandolfo. The play also contains the famous Florio's proverb, Venezia, Venezia, chi non ti vede non ti prezia. Further references in terms of style and language related to John Florio have brought scholars to describe the comedy as haunted by his presence. But another important source in the play, explained through Shakespeare's acquaintance with Florio, is the great amount of allusions to Giordano Bruno. The first scholars who pointed out Shakespeare's debt to the philosopher were Christian Barthelmess, Bernard Tischwit, William Koenig, and more recently Mrs. Frances Yates, Amalia Bonhoggart, and Hilary Gatti, who have corroborated the hypothesis that there is a connection between Giordano Bruno's comedy, The Candle Bearer, and Shakespeare's Law's Labus Lost. Both comedies touch on the same subjects: love, alchemy, pedantry, patriarchism, and anti-patriarchism. There is also an affinity in the act's structure topics. The first act focuses mainly on male protagonists, the second on women. In the third act, there is the pedant. In the fourth, accident. In the fifth and final act, the triumph of women and ridicule and punishment of the pedants. There is also an affinity on characters as well. Holofernes is the counterpart of Malfurio. Birod and Joan Bernardo are two detached observers, deus ex machina, or as Birod described himself, demigods. The three women have the same function in both comedies. They punish men, husbands, lovers, who have been perjurers and deceivers and have despised women in their femininity. The two comedies also contain the same symbols: candles, sun, stars, women, eyes. Besides from these similarities based on structure, plot points, and characters, there's also an affinity on language. Both authors create neologism, and both focus on the motif of light and shadow as concepts of truth and ignorance, which are the fundaments of Bruno's thought. They also ridicule their pedant and mock them using the same satirical language by defining them sheep during a game of spelling. Both authors denounce the writers on vulgar love who go mad about the bodily attraction of women and enumerate these in detail. Bruno, in his dedication to Philip Sidney in the preface of the Eroici Furori, for those eyes, for those cheeks, for their bosom, for their white, for their crimson, for their thumb, for their tooth, for their lip, for their hair, for their dress, and Biron when he's exposed by custard. When shall you see me write, thinking rhyme, or groan for John, or spend a minute's time pruning me? When shall you hear that I will prize a hand, a foot, a face, an eye, gait, a state, a brow, a breast, a waist, a leg, a limb? Both authors, in fact, depict the characters in the grip of heroic fury, as Navarre points out to Biron, which is no bad translation of Bruno's work, Eroici Furori. Bruno's influence in Shakespeare's Labus Rost rarely received positive feedbacks, and in the more recent years a silence has fallen over the Bruno-Shakespeare relationship like a pall. The reason of this exclusion is due to the lack of Bruno's works at the time without any translation available, therefore a missing vehicle of knowledge between the two writers. However, an intermediary has been found again in the figure of John Florio, who lived with Giordano Bruno for 2 years at the French embassy in London from 1583 to 1585. Bruno mentions Florio in his works, and Florio used Bruno's works, translating his thought and portrayed him as a satirical and healthy whip of pedants in the first dialogue of his Second Fruits. At the French embassy, Bruno wrote the most important works of his career, embarking on a literary and philosophical adventure that would become an intense battle against contemporary pedantry, hypocrisy, and intellectual cowardice. This was carried on through a linguistic revolution, in which his works, written in vernacular Italian, represent a rejection of Latin and the need to express himself in a new musical language that could embody his revolutionary thought. Similarly, Florio and Shakespeare carried on a common project with English language. They fostered an hybrid in pure vernacular represented as a Godly-Moffrey, used by Shakespeare in The Merry Wife of Windsor to promote an inclusive and expansive idea of our English tongue, or in the scenes of translation in A Midsummer Night's Dream that promote this linguistic practice made of translingual puns, Latinate neologism, and mistaken exchanges. Understanding the power of language, one of the lexical practice became copia, in which a word has the potential to represent a multitude, perhaps an infinity of possible significations, a further indication of their relation to Bruno's philosophy. 2 years after he died, burned at the stake, Bruno was commemorated by Florio, and the preface to the reader of Montaigne says, in which he wrote that his old fellow Lano taught him that from translations all science had its offspring. Translation which the author, as John Dryden reflected nearly a century later, assumes the liberty not only to vary from the words and sense, but to forsake them both as he sees occasion. Translation then not proposed as the pure art of translating, but to the larger meaning of translatio studi, and to the translator role as intellectual go-between. Florio understood that by borrowing words and plots from other languages and translating them, rewriting those sources, a new beautiful science would have flourished in England. In this superb preface to the reader, John Florio defended his art of translation with an narration image which now must be quoted. If nothing can be now said, but has been said before, he said well, if there be no new thing under the sun. What is that has been? That shall be, he said was wisest. We do the best then, but glean after other harvest, borrow their colours, inherit their possessions. What do they but translate? Perhaps usurp, at least collect. If we acknowledgment, it is well, if by stealth, it is too bad. In this our conscience is our accuser, posterity our judge, in that our study is our advocate, and you readers are jury. But the mixed vernacular that Florian Shakespeare proudly produced in both translation and theatre was at the centre of many criticism. George Putnam, in The Art of English Poesy, and the anti-theatrical polemicist John Green used the figure mingle-mungle to represent this issue contrast with a pure native vernacular. It is no coincidence that during his career, John Florio received many harsh attacks from his enemies, which carry racial inflection, because he described himself as Italian tongue, but English at heart, representing the two worlds he was living in, a man who was born in London, but grew up in European melting pot, and promoted a corrupt, mixed vernacular, introducing uncouth terms like perforce, certes, artful, ceremonious, couillon, stoccada, imbrocada, inordinate, cacodemon, presumptuous, entree, conscientious, tarnish, comport, efface, facilitate, amusing, debauchee, regret, effort, emotion. Compounds like marble-hearted, fresh, bleeding, hurly-burly, higgledy-piggledy, rough hue, pregnant wit. In this view, Florio was seen as a suspect double-tongued translator. In particular, he was described by Richard Hakluyt in First Fruits as bilingual Florio, to mean someone who moved easily between two different languages and cultures, but never been completely a part of any of them. Florio's words, in the preface of Second Fruits, in which he mentions to have enemies with a knife at command to cut my throat, because in Englishman Italian is a devil incarnate, a proverb symbolizing that mountainish inhumanity Shakespeare was conscious refugees had to face, explain the reason why he so often preferred to work behind the scenes. But the precariousness of Florio's liminal position as a bilingual intermediary and ambiguous go-between was also a source of power. His consciously desire to be frequently invisible among the literary circles in which he worked, the solitary figure at the center of the most exciting English Renaissance scene, in reality gave him the greatest tools to animate the scene. It is in this lost property, hybrid word of words, that Shakespeare and Florio found space of creative invention, translated from continental sources and implanted linguistic and cultural graft in the Elizabethan stage, offering potentially infinite possibilities of expression for an inclusive international community. The Italian sources used in the plays were still not translated in English when Shakespeare borrowed them, and in other instances, although the Italian source is translated into French or English, Shakespeare's plays often closer to the Italian original than to the translations or adaptations of the original. At times, there is also a verbal similarity, which adds to the evidence that Shakespeare had read the original Italian. The puzzling word used to explain Florio's role as a linguistic intermediary, or the dismissed overused expression through John Florio to explain the Italian sources he handed over to Shakespeare, are defective in many ways. They should clarify, for example, how Florio could translate these sources he owned in his library. Bandello's novels that inspire Much Ado About Nothing and Romeo and Juliet, Boccaccio's Decameron for symbol in measure for measure also ends well. The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Los Labus Laws, The Merchant of Venice, Gli Inganni by the Academy of the Thunderstruck for Twelfth Night, Fiorentino's Pecorone for The Merchant of Venice, Merry Wife of Windsor, Cinzio e Catomiti for Measure, and Othello, just to name a few. Florio's mere role as intermediary is not sufficient to explain Shakespeare's intimate and rare knowledge of some of the sources used in the plays based on borrowing and translation. On the contrary, it implies that Anglo-Italian was deeply involved in this activity. The harder would have been carried on without any remuneration or personal benefit. Previous scholars have hinted at Florio's involvement in theatre, and particularly Shakespeare's plays, but they have analyzed it merely as a problem, distorting it, and ultimately suggesting an entirely new approach that's never been addressed, therefore leaving the matter unsettled. I suggest that Florio's involvement in Shakespeare's plays is not a problem, but a solution, a synergetic collaboration between two authors who fostered the symbiotic project of a more inclusive world community, challenging those who wanted a pure language and those who today revenge the solo genius Shakespeare and his aide, Florio, promoted in English against Englishness, and recognized in collaboration or mingle-mangle a gift of invention, heartily enjoying a great feast of languages.